And I am going to mute whose microphone? Okay. If you'd like to jump in, just unmute your mic. But this way it'll reduce any extraneous room noise. I'm going to share the screen. And this time I will remember to share the screen, which I didn't during a session this morning. It's been a rough few months. So in any case, the presentation that I'm going to be sharing here is actually one that Judy Littlejohn and I put together to present at the Online Learning Consortium Accelerate Conference in Orlando last November, which just happened to be at Disney World. So that had nothing to do with why we were going to this conference. And also Rebecca and I presented. So Judy listed her name first, and she did most of the presentation. I did more of the website work on this. But there's some good resources, I think, here that'll be helpful. And let's talk a little bit first about what open pedagogy is. And if you'd like, you can either use chat or just turn on your mic if you'd like to jump in and ask a question or say something. We created a website, and let me actually share this with you in chat because it's going to be something we'll be looking at. And I hope it's a pretty nice resource. I think it's got a pretty good resource, and it's one that's going to be expanding. Let me see if I can get to the chat controls. There we go. So I am going to share this link, and I encourage you to open it up, maybe bookmark it, because if you do want to explore a project, it's designed to help anyone doing this. We put it together for this conference, but it's also been adopted by the SUNY Fact 2 Adaptive Learning Task Group, and as part of their report on open pedagogy. So what open pedagogy is, well, would anyone like to state what they think open pedagogy is, or their take? There's lots of definitions out there. Okay, well, I will. Open pedagogy is basically having students create content rather than just being more passive consumers. So, and we'll talk about a lot of examples of it. So generally, the key component of it is that students create content. It may be content that's released under an open educational resource license, under Creative Commons license, but the key is students are creating knowledge that they're sharing. It could be just within the class, or it could be more broadly. Many of the projects involve them sharing materials and creating content that's shared with a public audience anywhere in the world. So the sharing is a part of it. One of the things that students tend to value, I've done a few projects like this. I've done 2 book projects with my students during the capstone course, and I've now used 2 semesters of podcast projects where students create podcasts that are then publicly shared. One reaction I've gotten in each of the classes is students really like the fact that they're creating something that's shared on the web, that they've got something to show that they can share with their parents, to let them know what they've been learning. They can share with their friends. They can add it to their resumes or their Vitas. They can share it on grad school applications. They can share it with potential employers as a sample of their work. And they take a lot of pride in that type of thing. There's a lot of learning advantages. When students are engaged in a topic, when they're exploring something, it forces them to learn it much more deeply than when they're studying for a test. You know, students will study for a test, they'll learn it, they'll take the test, and they'll forget it very rapidly. But when they're creating something that they know is going to be shared, they're forced to fill in the gaps. And especially if there's some sort of peer review going on, they want to put something together that's a reasonably complete argument. And it generally results in much deeper exploration in the topics. It's very much a form of active learning. And the research on active learning is that it's far more effective in encouraging long-term recall than when students are just reading or listening to lectures and just repeating things back on tests or even essays. One of the nice features about it is it avoids, well, it's a form of non-disposable assignment. And this was a term that was used by David Wiley, I believe, first. And I first heard it from Robin DeRosa, where they noted that many of the assignments we have students do is something that they complete, They either turn it in class, and sometimes they get it back, sometimes they don't. When it comes back to them, it goes in a pile, or often it just goes in a trash can at the end of the semester, and they never look at it again. With open pedagogy, they're creating something that lasts beyond the course. If they're using Blackboard, as so many of us now are, even if we weren't using it before, typically what happens is students submit things, they're in Blackboard, they can see them typically, everything they created during a semester, but as soon as the semester ends, that all goes away. They no longer have access to it. It disappears. So anything they create is gone when the semester is over, unless they happen to save their own copy. Here, they're creating something that's publicly shared. And that, again, puts more value on it. There's a lot of research on how when people create things that are shared or that are kept or persistent, they value it much more. Dan Ariely did some experiments where she had people just create these little, well, a number of different things, basically. One is that paper folding thing. What is that called? What is that called? When you make the little cranes and things from paper?
Origami?
Origami, I'm sorry, yes. Okay, when he had people create origami, and then he asked people how much they valued their own, and then he asked people how much they valued those created by others, and the work that they did themselves is worth a lot more. Another example he used of this is that when Betty Crocker first released cake mixes, all you did is you add water, you stirred it, you put it in a pan, people baked it, and virtually no one bought it because they didn't feel they had created it, that they were just adding water to it. So they changed your recipe, so you had to put in an egg and you had to put in milk or butter or something. And then all of a sudden their sales skyrocketed, because when people actually feel that they're creating something, they value it a lot more than if it's something that seems to be prepackaged, that doesn't have that same intrinsic value as something they create. It can also involve some type of service. For example, if you're creating educational content that future students would use, if you're contributing to Wikipedia, if you're providing a resource that others may use, that service component of it tends to give the work more value by itself. And for all these reasons, it tends to be much more motivational for students. Just some very quick examples, and we'll hop over to that resource in just a minute, but there's a lot of examples that people use. Blogs is one of the most commonly used ones, where students, sometimes the blogs are just about their educational journey. They're talking about what they're learning and making connections in what they're learning in class to the rest of their lives and so forth. But they're sharing it publicly, at the very least within the class, and possibly beyond that. We've had a few examples where students have created glossaries on campus. Maya Brown has done that. And there was one other example I don't remember offhand, but we've talked to a couple of people on a podcast about that. I think it's with someone in the English faculty at Cortland. Her last name is Sathonica, and the first name starts with a D. I don't remember offhand. Well, in any case, she had students create glossaries for the literature she was working on that was then publicly shared. Students could create videos that are shared on YouTube, or at least shared within the class. There's a lot of wiki projects out there that people have done. There's something called Wiki EDU, which Wiki Education, where people from Wikipedia work with you and create a class construct, basically, which makes it easier for you to see the work that your students are doing and to evaluate it, keep track of it, and so forth. But it becomes part of the whole Wikipedia output. There was a case I saw in a podcast on the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast, where students in a Portuguese language class visited or worked on a Portuguese wiki for the city they were living in Texas. So what happened basically is there was virtually nothing about their city there, but they were forced to write in Portuguese about something they knew. And that was a very authentic learning experience where they were actually writing in the language they were learning. Annotations is another common thing, where students will annotate open resources on the web. For example, Robin DeRosa, who's done a lot of early work with open pedagogy, has had students create Well, the backstory is she noted how expensive the textbook she was using in her class on early American literature. And then she realized that all of the actual content in there was in the public domain. So she created her own anthology, or her students went out, found similar, put together their own mix of early American literature, and then they annotated that and created a new collection that is then publicly shared with their annotations. And there's lots of ways of doing that. Students can easily create book projects. I got a presentation on that a little bit later. You could also have students do research and publicly share their research, or they could do collections. At FIT, the Fashion Institute of Technology, they have a fashion history timeline where students gather resources about things that were created in the past, and they share images and stories about those in a public, basically a public story of the evolution of fashion. There's a lot of projects where students have collected oral histories about some event that occurred, or where students have gone out and taken photos of something as part of a development project in the community, or done some other type of research and shared that publicly. So there's some issues if you want to try one of these that you should think about. One is students are not, yes, thank you, Randy. Danica Savonik, very good. I knew it started with a D, but we just did 2 podcasts with someone named Dorina, and I kept mixing up Dorina with Danica. So in any case, that's a really good podcast. She's doing some great work down at Cortland. But students are not always used to copyright, so you do have to familiarize them with copyright rules, especially if they're going to be publishing things publicly on the web. And you can remind them that anything they publish, if they're just copying and pasting from something else, people will notice, and that really doesn't look very good for them. But we also need to talk to them about their copyright. In the work I've had my students do, I give them all the Creative Commons licenses and ask them which one they chose. And in each case, they've chosen the least restrictive version, so that they've released things under basically a CC BY license, which basically, if anyone uses the work, not the least restrictive, the least restrictive is public domain release, but they use the CC BY license, which basically means that if anyone uses any of the work, they're supposed to provide them with attribution. But otherwise, they let people remix it, use it in their own work or in any form, as long as they're getting some credit for it. Another issue is you have to be really careful about protecting student identity. Not all students are willing to have work shared publicly. There's 2 common ways of dealing with that. One is you give them the option of creating work that's only shared within the class, or you let them publish things under a pseudonym. As long as you can track what they're doing and are able to observe it, it doesn't matter what name they're going out under. And some people who do open pedagogy projects allow students to submit works of the project under anonymous, so they don't even need to create a pseudonym. One major problem with many open pedagogy projects is sustainability. There were a lot of these things started about 10 to 12 to 15 years ago in the earlier time period of the web, where there were these wonderful projects that a professor put together, put up on a website, then that professor retired or moved to another institution, and then it all disappeared. And so, if you really want to give students projects that'll persist beyond the semester, it's helpful to make sure that there's some way of sustaining it. And the other thing, which is really good training for students, is to teach them a little bit about accessibility, that anything they're going to publish publicly must meet accessibility standards. In particular, any videos has to have a transcript, any audio should have a transcript, and any images needs to have image tags in it so that it can be read by screen readers and so on, as well as imposing structure on the document with header. If they're releasing something in text, that there's header levels, H1, H2, and so forth, embedded in the document, again, for the purpose of screen readers and so on. So those are some of the main issues that you should build into the instruction and share with resources with students and build into the project if you want to do one. The student feedback has generally been positive. Some students were a little apprehensive at first, but generally if you give them the option of opting out, it can reduce some of the pressure. This is something actually that Judy put together in her class. I haven't really served it in my students, although I did do a podcast with some of them, and I'll share that in a minute. So one of the questions she asked is, how did knowing that the work would be published online affect how they approached the research project they were doing there? That was an intro history class. And in general, either students said it caused them to take the work more seriously, or they did the usual work and it didn't make a difference. None of them said that it caused them to value the work lower. When I've talked to my own students about it, and again, 4 of them talked about it on a podcast last summer, what they said is they really liked the fact that they could share their work publicly, and it gave them a much greater sense of meaning and value in the work than they typically did in class projects. So in terms of options, let's hop over to that website, and you're encouraged to look at it as we go. And I won't talk too much longer. I want to ask what people might be interested in doing. When we did this as a presentation, we did it actually as a, basically where it was a longer presentation at OLC where people got together in groups and started putting together a project proposal. So this website basically has a number of options. The first is an overview of what open pedagogy is, but what probably is most useful if you're thinking about a project is this page. And if you scroll down here, it's a list of all those project types we listed, as well as some examples of those. So for example, under blogs, here's some examples of blogs that students or classes have put together. And in addition to that, you just click on the word to get it. Here's some resources on how to get to it. And we're adding to this as we go. Some of them have more resources than others. And similarly, here's some examples of collections, portfolios, research projects, podcasts. Vanderbilt has a whole podcast series where many classes have student podcasts, and then the best of those are selected in a Vandy Vox podcast, which is the best of all the student podcasts from each of the classes. The students vote on what was the best podcast in the class, and then that comes out under a college-wide release. And again, the feedback there has been really, really positive. So one thing I didn't mention, and I guess we didn't include in that slide, we may have added later, was student-selected ancillaries, where some people, someone who works a lot with Robin DeRosa, his Twitter name is that psych professor. I don't remember his name offhand, but it's at that psych prof is his Twitter handle. He has been doing for several years an assignment in his intro psych class where students submit multiple choice questions to a test bank, basically, that then is evaluated by other students in their class. And then some of those questions are used within the class to generate a somewhat less standard test bank than the ones that comes with most publishers, which are also generally subject to all sorts of, which, as Liz has noted in some past work, and I've done too, which tend to end up on all the academic dishonesty sites really, really quickly. But what he's found is that when students spend time crafting good questions and they're evaluated on the level of the questions, it actually often results in much more learning than when they're just given the questions. So the act of putting together good questions at a variety of cognitive levels may be more effective in increasing learning than actually taking a multiple choice, a short answer, or other type of test. There's been lots of student video projects and so forth. So I want to stop here for a minute and ask what you might be interested in. If, by the way, you find anything that's interesting, add this. It goes to a Google form, and generally I'll add this the next time I get some free time to go back and add things to the website. So, any questions or comments or thoughts? Are there any projects that you might be interested in trying?
John, what's the best way to get started? Should you jump into it right away, or should you kind of build it slowly over a few semesters?
It depends. Yeah, my own take is just to jump in right away, but that's just my nature. You can do some small things. For example, you could just have students do a blogging assignment. You could even do that within Blackboard, but again, it disappears later. You could,
For sustainability kinds of issues, should I create my own web page?
That's probably the best way of doing it. And what I've done, I've had students create books, and I've had them post them on, or they ended up posted on Pressbooks. And there you can get a free account, which has a certain amount of storage. It's probably enough for most student-created books, but you get that little, if you print a copy of it, it has that little image, a watermark on it saying that this is a free copy of Pressbooks. If you pay a little bit or a bit more, I think it's like $20 or $100, then you get effectively unlimited storage. The watermark disappears, and you can also download it as a PDF, and you can also upload it to the Kindle store if you want to. So you could make a free book out of it. The only restriction there, and this is partly because I'm just not very good at that type of thing, I told the 2 classes that did that, if any one of them would design artwork and a cover art that would match the Kindle requirements in terms of screen resolution, colors, it has to be done in CMYK and other things, then I'd be happy to upload it because it exports really directly. So far, neither class as a student agreed to design the cover art. So they have access to the books online, but they don't actually, they can't download it to a Kindle. They could download it as a PDF, or they can access it on the web. But once you put it there, it'll stay there indefinitely, or at least as long as Pressbooks.com is in business. You know, there's always a possibility that these things may go under. Similarly, if you you can do it on college sites. You know, the other thing I've had students do is podcasts where I had them hosted on a server. If you use one of the free servers, they will be there as long as the free server is in business. There's 2 that I know of, Anchor and I forgot the other one, SoundCloud. SoundCloud and Anchor are 2 services where if you upload it there, you can leave the podcast there indefinitely. And so they would tend to persist even if you stop doing it, or if you stop, you know, if you left academia or whatever. So they could last, at least as, again, with web services, you never know what may happen, but at least there's some degree of permanence. You know, I actually have, this is hosted on a server I bought last year. For $25, you can get a year's access to Reclaim Hosting server. I actually have 5 domains on here now. I have one for my econometrics book. I have this, which we use for this conference. We just put together another one for that workshop we put together for faculty here and at GCC. And there's still another one that we've used for something else. I don't remember. But it's all hosted on this one domain that I just pay an annual fee for. Because I've got so much there, I'm paying $99 a year or $95 a year, and then another $10 a year for each of the domains. But that could be a nice persistent resource too. Because the college as a whole, we don't really have any, we don't have many, other than websites, we don't really have much to host blogs or other things. We can do it in Blackboard, but we don't have a public-facing blog. But you can do free hosting in WordPress.com or paid hosting in WordPress.org, which is kind of the reverse of what you'd expect. But you could always create a class blog, and that would be out there indefinitely, again, as long as WordPress.com is in business. So, you know, and then if you wanted more, if you wanted better themes or, you know, more features, you might have to pay a little bit as a one-time fee. But WordPress is a really nice option where you can either have the students upload things to you in Blackboard or in Google Drive or whatever, and then you could post them later. So, but if you just want to do an entry-level thing, a blog would be a good place to start. If you want to have students just do a podcast, you could have them do it over a few weeks and submit it. I had them do it 2 podcasts in the semester, but I did it in a number of stages. The book project was a whole semester project where they started off as a group deciding a topic. And, you know, when they have more say over what they're creating, you know, you give them the general guidelines that meet the overall course learning objectives. But within that, they were given quite a bit of flexibility. They chose quite a bit of the structure of the course and the structure of the project, and that they valued quite a bit. So you can do as much as you want or as little as you want. And it might not be bad to try a small thing. One simple strategy you could use, and I actually did that last semester, is instead of in the fall, I had everyone do 2 podcasts, either individually or in teams, teams of 2. In the spring, I gave them the option of doing that or a more traditional writing assignment. Most of them chose a more traditional writing assignment because it was just more comfortable. But I did have, I think, 6 people out of a class of 35 or so who chose to do the podcast project. So, it depends on the project. You could do something which is a collection, which is posted publicly. That might not be all that difficult. You could do an annotation of some online works, which could be just a 1 or 2 week project. Or you could build something into the whole semester. So.
Okay. What is WordPress you recommend? What about TypePad? I've heard people. You know anything about TypePad? Is that?
I don't know as much about TypePad. I know Rebecca has used that for some projects. WordPress is pretty much a standard for blogs, though. It probably accounts for most of them. I mean, there used to be other platforms. Most of the others have gone by the wayside. WordPress has been there for quite a while. And something like 60% of the web actually runs on WordPress. So it's also the basis for a lot of the public websites out there. So it's a blogging platform, but it's also much more than that. It's an easy to use interface. And one advantage of WordPress is if students are going off into other jobs where they might be doing posting web content, there's a better than average chance that they might be using WordPress in the future.
I'm a little naive about this. Is WordPress and Pressbooks, are those connected in some way?
Yes and no. WordPress actually was created as an open source platform that other people can adapt. And Pressbooks is built on the WordPress platform. I can show you what a WordPress site looks like. In fact, I have one open here for one of my class projects. Or I did have one open here for one of my class projects, and apparently I closed it. So let me hop over to that. I'll show you what it looks like when the project is created. This is the book that student created last year, and it's released under a Creative Commons attribution. And here's the book. There's a little preface that I put together. And then over here, if you click on contents, there's 3 parts to the book, and each one is broken down into a number of chapters. And if you look at the chapters, for example, you can see what the students did. So, here's discrimination. The author of those chapters are up there. And what Pressbooks did basically is they took the WordPress interface and they added styles for a book. So they added chapters, they added, subchapters, appendix, and front matter, and so forth. So basically, it's like you're editing in WordPress, but you're doing that in a book format. So
when the students are drafting in the very early stages, where do they work?
I have not had them work in here in these projects. What I have them work in is Google Drive, because that's so much easier for collaboration, because you can't have 2 people editing the same document at the same time. And because I had three people this year and 3, in a couple of cases, 4 during this current spring, it was just easier for them to collaborate in Google Drive. And the other thing is I wanted to be able to track the individual contributions of each student. So what I had them do is jointly we decide what the format would be in terms of the heading structure, in terms of the citations they were going to use, the footnote styles, and so forth. So we had a whole class discussion about that. Then while we were doing that, I created a template, shared it with them for their chapters. They copied that into the individual folders they were assigned within the class folder, and then they did all the work within the folder. So each chapter of the book, it started with first an outline. The outline, so that they added first a bibliography, then an annotated bibliography. Then that became a rough draft of the chapter, and then a second draft of the chapter, and then the final version. All that was done right within a Google document. with the formatting, the font size, the type, and so forth agreed. The only modification was each person would write what they did in their own particular color. And they put at the top of the document their name and in the color that they were using for their own contributions. So it was, otherwise you could look at the editing history to see how much each person did. But when you've got hundreds of different stages of editing and they're going back and forth at the same time, it's so much easier just to see the blocks and to skim over to see and to be able to assess how much each individual contributed. So that was something I picked up from someone at Buffalo who did that, because I used to try to look at the editing history for that, and just looking at the color code makes it so much easier. So all the work is done there because it's easy. Then when they're finished, I actually copied it into WordPress because it's into Pressbook, because it's a little bit tricky for students to learn that, because first you have to invite them to Pressbooks and they have to accept that and create their own account. And then you have to elevate them as authors and give them rights to specific chapters. And if you've got 30 to 35 students, it's a fair amount of coordination difficulties. I did try that and it just got too unwieldy. So we just stayed right in Google Docs. And when they were done, basically I just copied and pasted it in, and then I went through and added the header structures, because even though they had used a header structure, that didn't all format correctly when it moved over to Pressbooks. But the basic outline was there. The footnotes came across okay. All the rest of the structure came across. So it was just blocking text and assigning it, as A-level head, B-level heads, and so forth. But yeah, Google Docs is, I think, the easiest way for them to collaborate.
So you didn't use the WordPress process there. You just went from Google.
Not in this case. I went directly to that. Yeah. Now, if you're doing a blogging thing, then if you're going to do a blogging process over the semester, then you probably do want to assign students to do it. In my case, I was more concerned about the writing and not letting them learn the interface. But if I was going to have them do reflective logs throughout the semester, then I would have invited them all to the WordPress that I had set up. They'd have to create their accounts, and then they'd each have their own area to post in, where their posts would be labeled with their name or their pseudonym, as the case may be.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it's easy enough to do that, but it just added a little bit more complexity, and it would have been harder for me to assess their work, and it would have been harder for them to work at the same time on it. So it was just easier to go from Google Drive in that case, because there was one final product. It wasn't a series of individual posts. It was just a joint effort by each group became the chapter. So if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. This is very helpful.
Any other question? Or are there any specific projects you might think about?
I didn't have anything specific, but I just wanted to try to do things differently than the passive assignments that generally I give. Last semester I had people actually looking for legislative policies and trying to link those to their readings, just trying to get them to engage and how their stuff plays out in the real world. But I think this is an even better idea.
One thing that worked really well for me in terms of the project that we just completed, as well as the year before, is I want to show you how they did the peer review. So I had them do peer reviews as they work through each stage, and that's something that can work really well in lots of classes. So let me go to, apparently I already have put the past semester behind me. There's so many reasons to do that, but let me turn that back on for a moment. I was just trying to clean up my list, so sorry about that. So one more time, bringing back the spring for a moment here. I'm going to jump into a class where they actually did all this in Blackboard. They saved the work in Google Drive. I downloaded each of their products at each stage and then uploaded them as PDFs in Blackboard. So I'm going to jump in just to show you how the project, these were the readings they were doing each week, but then there's also these folders where they were doing, well, here's a review of the rough drafts, let's say. And in here, each one of these is a chapter that was produced by 3 or 4 students. And if you just hop into one of it, you could see the chapter and you could see the color coding. This is all work that was final work that was ended up, but you could see the colors that each person did. But you notice here, there's comments all the way through, and it's all highlighted. So what I did is I assigned each group to review and to provide each student in each group to provide comments on each of 3 other chapters. So the first group would comment on the next 3, the second chapter, the authors of the second chapter would comment on chapters 4, 5, and 6, 3, 4, and 5, and so forth, and looping back, so that each chapter was reviewed by at least 9 people, and they were getting feedback from at least 9 people on each. And if they want to see the project, the feedback was generally quite good. So there's feedback all the way through here. Some of it was from me, but much of it was from students. And so you could see what they were commenting on as they move through by just clicking on it. And for students to annotate the work, all they had to do while they're reading it is just to highlight the phrase, and then they could click annotate, and they could add some comments about it. So I'll just put a test annotation here. And then that just becomes embedded right in the document. And this I found to be an incredibly powerful tool for peer reviews and getting peer feedback. You also have the option of leaving page notes on the whole thing right here by clicking on that. And then you could comment on the overall structure of the chapter. But this is basically how it all took place.
John, what program is that in?
That's right in Blackboard. It's the hypothesis tool that we had here for about a year, and we have it through the fall. Beyond that, we may have to pay for it. We'll probably have to pay for it. But you could also do the same thing outside of Blackboard. All we'd have to pay for the spring is the integration of this into Blackboard. You could do the same thing in Google Drive and embed the links in Blackboard without having with this version, there's actually gradebook integration if you wanted to do it that way, and it automatically creates a class group, and students don't need a separate login and they don't need a separate account, which makes it a whole lot easier, because anyone in the class would automatically be able to click. What it does basically is you put a link here to anything either on the web or upload any PDF document, and then when people click on it, they can add those annotations. It's also a good way to have students annotate or mark up a work, an article, a story, a novel, or, to do some reviews of something. And then you basically just put in anything in here that is in text or even a web page, and then students can go out and leave comments on it, and only the people within the class will be able to see those comments. And the other thing is you can also comment on the comments. So you can get a threaded discussion going on a document. I've used this in one of my classes to have students, for example, in place of a discussion forum, to listen to a podcast and then annotate either page annotations on that or add annotations to the transcript of that, marking it up and trying to make connections between what they learned and what they were reading or hearing in that podcast. And again, that's a real nice way of letting students make connections between, and this, certainly we were doing this quite a bit with COVID. And, for this year's class, the focus was on wage differentials. And, we were talking a lot about the labor market and so forth and making connections to that. And that became some of the discussions, and some of it was done using this tool. So it's used a lot in open pedagogy projects in general.
Yeah, very useful.
And that's another way of sharing annotations. If you use this with public annotations, you can do this with classic literature or anything in the public domain that's stored on the web. You can have students go in and annotate it and add examples and add citations and put things in historical context or do other things with it. So it's a really powerful tool. And I found that students have been had so much more fun doing projects like this than if they were, doing traditional papers. Last year, when I first did this in the capstone course, I gave them 3 options. I said, one option is you could do the traditional, sort of like senior thesis term paper that everyone did. Yes, well, I'll get right back to Liz's question. And I said, or we could have each person write something on a general theme, and I gave them some suggested topic, or you could come up with your own topic. And they chose to come up with your own topic. They threw some things, we put them up on the board back when we were physically in the classroom, and then they talked about it and said, well, maybe we can combine these. And they, well, you know, most of these all have the common theme of we're looking at why people have different wages, for example, this year. And last year they were talking about income inequality. You know, that was been in the news a lot. And so in both cases, they said, why don't we just take that as a general theme and then look at it from different perspectives? And then they went through and put it, you know, broke it all up and did it this way. Now, Liz said, did I have to guide students about what it means to annotate? I was able to do it in this class right in the class because we started off in the classroom, and it didn't really take much effort. I just showed them. Here's an example. You open it up, you highlight what you want to, this part was more heavily annotated. You just mark it, then you get that right below, and then you just provide annotations. The other thing you could do with that, and this is something that Gardner Campbell has done, I didn't, but if you choose to annotate something, you also have the ability to add tags. So he uses specific sets of tags for assignments where he has students go out and find things on the public web, and then he has them create tags that refer to things they're discussing in class. And then if you click on any of those tags, it will display all the passages that are marked up with that tag and the comments that were placed about them. And by the way, this is a great tool for your own research. So if you go out and find things on the web, you can create your own personal hypothesis account, not in Blackboard, but outside of that. You could add the extension to the browser, and then you can go in and just find things that are interesting to you. You might have a number of different areas you're working on. Just add tags specific to that. And then all you have to do is click on the tag. It will give you your notes and a link to the source document, and you can go back right to where you found it. So if you're thinking about writing a book or writing an article or doing some new research on a topic, you can just find tags relevant to that. Or what some people do is when they're looking through news articles or blog posts or other things, they'll have tags that are specific to their class. And when they run across an article and they're in Chrome, they'll just click on the hypothesis things, tag the article, or put some notes about it with whatever the keywords are. And then when they get to that portion of the course, they'll just pull it into the discussion as relevant. So I did do some examples, but primarily they just kind of took to it pretty naturally in terms of using hypothesis. But again, this was in a class of seniors, so you know they're a little more. They probably were more used to this type of work than perhaps freshmen might have been.
You have like a rubric about like annotation quality. So if I can imagine a situation where students maybe offer a lot of annotations, but they're very limited and they're very minor versus more substantive. I don't know if you're guiding them as you go along in the process and saying.
I did, yes, I did. We did talk about that in class. And when I scored it, basically, I said there has to be a minimum for each student of 3 substantive annotations. And I said, you know, just saying this is really good or something like that would not count as a substantive annotation. So I used a pretty simple criteria. Very few students did the minimum. Some of the students would put 10 or 12 or 15 annotations on a given document. So, you know, but again, they're seniors and many of them were better motivated, you know, and they generally really appreciated the feedback from others. And when the other people in the class heard how much they appreciated the feedback, I think that helped provide more intrinsic motivation. The main issue is I had a couple of students, you know, who've been this way for years. You know, I think Liz and I both know some of these students. They were sometimes a little slow in doing this, and a couple of them didn't really do much at all, at least initially, until they started seeing all those zeros in their grade book add up over time. And then they got to work. Now, I provided feedback. I reminded them. I put a note out to them, you know, but sometimes it took a couple of weeks to get them going. But most of the annotations were pretty substantive. You know, I mean, they're not, you know, most of them were at least a few sentences. Some were, you know, if it's a comment like this, where it just says there's a gap missing or just a little grammar, correction. Generally, that didn't count as a substantive thing, but students were still providing that as a service to their peers.
Yeah, seems almost like the issue of substantiveness in discussion posts, where people like, I agree with what Randy said, and that's like their, you know.
Yeah, and that is in my rubrics for online discussions. I didn't really do anything very careful here. Partly I was just overwhelmed this semester, but in general, it really wasn't much of an issue. Most of this, pretty much, the students either provided substantive feedback, or at least on whole, it was substantive feedback, or they just took the week off from that activity. And, there wasn't really much in between. So, and we discussed it because every week the class met. Even when we moved remote, we'd talk about how things were going, and people would say, well, we appreciate grammar corrections, but they don't really help us improve the writing very much. So, that type of feedback also, the feedback from peers about the feedback tend to result in better quality feedback in general. But yes, a rubric would be good. And I should have used one for this. I did for everything else. For my own feedback, I did on the chapters and the drafts and so forth. But I didn't have a rubric for the feedback, other than telling them I would only count it and they could get up to 3 points each time on this for each of the 3. So it was a 9-point assignment in each of the 5 or 6 page stages of this that they use as they move through. So any other questions on this sort of thing? In general, it's been pretty well received. There's always a couple of evaluations where someone said, the class was not very well structured because much of the class was around this project, or what was it, or the class objectives weren't well defined at the start, because to a large extent they were left up to the students for this component of the class. They had other assignments, they had other readings, they had other assessments. They also were doing weekly presentations, some of it related to this, some of it on other topics. But this was a part that some of them were a little troubled by the more amorphous nature of it. But most of them came around. I think there were 1 or 2 comments like that at the end of the term this time on it. Most students, though, generally really liked it. Any other questions? I would encourage you, if you want to explore it, look at some of the resources there. There's a lot of really good examples of open pedagogy projects out there. And from everything I've heard from other people and everything I've seen myself, students really like it. And it really reduces the incentives for academic dishonesty to the extent to which you can replace exams where they can just hire someone out to give them answers for their exams. When they're creating something like this and you're scaffolding it from the ground up, it's much less likely that they're going to try to hire it out or steal from other people, especially if it's been scaffolded and you work with them and helping them shape it all the way through. Now, there are examples where that's violated. For example, there have been hundreds of podcasts created at Vanderbilt University, but there's been at least one case where a student submitted a podcast that was entirely copied by reading the transcript of another person's podcast. And one of the ways in which that you can detect that, of course, is running the transcript through SafeAssign. And I have done that with the podcast projects. You have them submitted there, and that way you can at least see if they're just copying something, if they're just repeating words they found elsewhere. You talk to them about it, but you may want to just verify that this really is their work. But the more you're involved in helping them shape it from the ground up, the less likely it is that they'll be able to find something that customized, or even to hire someone to create some custom work for them, or it becomes a bit more expensive. And for the most part, students tend to take more pride in this type of public-facing output, I think.
John, a lot of students may already have been on blogging. What would be the next step up from blogging? I'm thinking about using this with freshmen in our freshman writing course. Do you have a sense of, is there a sequence in terms of pedagogically speaking, if the seniors and the juniors are kind of more capable, what's the media?
I mean, one thing, you could start having them collect and annotate other work, that could be an intermediate thing where they might find some public domain work or, things that have been released to the public domain. And then they could create an anthology in a specific area. For example, Robin DeRosa's project started off with early American literature, but then another class took that and completely redid that in terms of indigenous peoples' writings about early American literature and so forth. So, you can have, or you could do something on gender, or you could do some, basically take the same sort of topic, but then do a different take and have students provide commentary and annotations, because once things are in a public domain, you can take all that, put it in documents, and then they could add footnotes and citations and introductory notes. And, that type of thing could be a step above just simple reflective blogging where they're actually.
Yeah. Okay, that's very helpful. I just had to have a sense of how to build, to move them from where they are. Yeah, that'll do it.
And within, but even within blogging, they could do reflective blogs at a low level where they're just talking about their learning. The next stage is they could be doing some critical reviews of work that they're publishing, or they could be doing, general essays on a topic that is publicly shared. So, we've got some pretty good professionals out there writing blogs, and so even within any one of these, there's different levels.
Right. Okay. So, thank you.
Well, thanks. Okay, I guess we're just about out of time. But if anyone's interested now, one thing I should note is for the last year, and this is expiring, we had free accounts for students and faculty under an IITG grant. We had applied for continuation of that with the doubling of accounts. It was a 5-campus application. It was ranked second highest in its category, but none of the funds from that have been released yet. And my guess is, given the budget issues, we probably won't get that. But there's always a chance. And that way we get free access to WordPress. Each student could have their own domain. They could have their own website, basically. But we're losing that as of July 1st, unless that gets funded in some other way. So, but again, you could also buy one of your own for $30 per the year, or you could have students do it. I know Rebecca did that in her classes, where she had basically each student pay for their own $30 a year account, and they use that to create portfolios and create websites and do their work on it. And then if they chose, they could just continue that after they left Oswego. So, or, you could pay or have your department pay for an account, and then you could have your students all share that. Okay, I will stop the recording. But if anyone's interested, let me know, and I'm happy to work with you. I think these projects are lots of fun. I've been as the chair of Fact2 a couple of years ago, I put together a task group on that. And that task group is just finished.